We're talking this week about narrative films, narrative comedies, and in particular, we're emphasizing a genre that flourished in the 1930s and not so much after that, and that is the screwball comedy. Screwball comedy is a variety of romantic comedy, and I wanted to start out with our slideshows this week, just kind of previewing different critical approaches to this genre of film so that we can hopefully work our way up to asking these kinds of questions. The thing about screwball comedy is in some ways it seems to be a example of a transgressive comedy. That is a kind of comedy that breaks rules, that undermines social norms or conventions, and therefore presents some kind of challenge to the status quo. So Screwball can be seen in some ways as a satire of your conventional romantic movies, where we're seeing those conventions of how romance typically is portrayed being undermined in one way or another. So some of the characteristics of Screwball is that there's unconventional behavior, and that ties into our notions about gender and how the genders are supposed to behave. There's plays with norms of conduct and propriety, inside and outside of relationships and sex. And there's also play with conventions of being serious about what it means to be in love, what love and pairing is about. So Screwball has a variety of these elements that seem somewhat socially disruptive, but it also has a fundamentally conservative element of reconfirming the heterosexual pairing being the social norm. The couple, the heterosexual couple, is being the norm, not only of marriage, but the appropriate channel for sexuality and desire. So that's just a little preview. I also want to be a little more explicit now about thinking about an overall critical model for how we approach thinking about film. And in this class, this is a critical studies class. We're studying comedy critically. We're looking at films. And what we're essentially trying to do is we're looking at films, we're looking at television programs, and we're trying to identify and make connections in those films, in those TV, amongst various different elements that are at work in order to make a critical argument about those films or television programs. We've done that, for example, talking about the Eric Andre show, and an example is anarchistic comedy, and we looked at the Elkins essay as a model of trying to apply theory to make connections between how the show is made, the kinds of performance, and different strategies towards making comedy. So that's one example of what we do as critics. And this model that I've put together here is essentially kind of making explicit where it is we're looking to make connections. Okay, so we have programs themselves, but the things or films themselves, but the things that we're connecting are the kinds of artistic elements, aesthetic choices. And in our case, that would be approaches to comedy. What kind of comedy? Is it like gross out humor? Is it verbal humor? Is it slapstick? Those things all fall into aesthetics, aesthetic strategies, the creative strategies, our sense of art in making and producing creative commercial content in our case. Industrial logics have to do with the industry that produces and distributes screen comedy, right? So that's what really distinguishes studying screen comedy from, say, a comic novel that one person wrote. Industrial logics. How does this particular film or program fit into the broader entertainment industry? And then we have aspects outside of that industry, outside of that particular film. That is the culture in which it is produced, in which people make sense of that. So that's contemporary culture. So we as critics look at particular examples of media, but we're trying to make all different kinds of connections in order to make some argument about that particular film, or just to understand it, right? So again, this is kind of a preview of what we're going to be doing this week. I previewed critical ways of thinking about screwball comedy, and then in the coming slideshows, I'm going to talk more about the industrial logics of the industry, where these things came from, as well as the contemporary culture a little bit. Now, to think about aesthetics, one aspect of aesthetics, indeed, that we've already talked about is narrative structure. And in comedy, one of the things that we, on a very basic level, expect, and in fact is a defining structure, is that there's a happy ending. But what is the narrative structure that can help us accomplish that happy ending? Well, this has been a topic that people have written about for a very long time. And there's a neoclassical model of narrative structure that was actually first formulated way back in the 4th century. And in fact was very popular even during the Renaissance with people writing, creating comedy, and it's gone on and remained popular and useful. So in some ways, if you've ever studied 3-act structure, this is a little bit like that. But we're going to talk about it now explicitly as being about comedy and different elements of the comic narrative structure, and then hopefully apply this to the films and TV shows that we watch, some of them anyway, feature films especially. So the neoclassical model of comedy says that there has to be a stage of exposition, or the protasis. So the exposition is going to be establishing who our character is, the general setting, what they're like. And then there's got to be some complication, the epitasis. The complication sets things in motion. Okay? The epitasis is that complicating factor. Then, a little bit later, there's an additional complication which changes things even more. And that is the catastasis. So we have exposition, complication, and new complication, working our way up to catastrophe, which is the resolution. So these should sound familiar to you, again, if you studied 3-act structure, because we do apply these terms there. But when it comes to catastrophe and the resolution with comedy, this is particular to the comedy model. Okay, so the catastrophe consists of two different things. A resolution consists of two different things. A reversal of fortune, or the peripeteia, which if it's a comedy, that means you're going to go from a moment where everything just looks completely terrible to being good, right? So for example, that can happen extremely quickly. Like in Duck Soup, that happens, they're about to lose this battle, everything's awful, and then the guy's head gets stuck in the door and they throw a bunch of tomatoes at him or whatever it is, and everything's okay, right? That's a very quick reversal of fortune. Now, the other element of the catastrophe is a transition from ignorance to knowledge, the agnoresis. Now, that is something that I don't think you see really in Duck Soup at all, and I think that has to do with the overall complete lack of the importance of the actual narrative. In romantic comedies or screwball comedies, we will see more of that because the narrative is much more important. And from here on through the class, this is really one of the things I want you to look at when we look at narrative film, in particular narrative comedies. What kind of transition is there in the character? We're really going to see that. Some kind of transition or transformation, and often it's from ignorance to knowledge, right? And there's not only this overt reversal of fortune, but on a deeper level, the character, how the character changes, there's this transformation from ignorance to knowledge. So as critics, these are things that we can think about, not just identifying, okay, those moments happen, but what are actually the forces that cause them to happen? What are the particular elements or events that enable these kinds of reversals of fortune or these transitions? What are the conflicts that get in the way? What are the obstacles that make them difficult? What's specific about those to the time, the place, within the film and outside the film too?